Okay, I think we should start. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you. That's great. Hello, I'm Aldis Lucas, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the third in the What Talk series. Today, I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce Dr. Stephen Munro of the National Museum of Australia. As I'm sure Stephen will tell us, he has a similar background to many of us in that he did something you're not really supposed to do. He read Elaine Morgan's work with an open mind and came to the conclusion that it all made perfect sense. We have a bit more in common on top of that. We both independently were sufficiently inspired by Elaine to return to academia to the point of obtaining a PhD in a related subject. And we also share a geographical connection to the city of Perth, although through one of those strange coincidences, Stephen's early young life in Perth was coming to a close just as our older retiring life was about to start here. I think we only overlapped for a couple of months before Stephen went off to study at ANU in Canberra and has continued his impressive career there ever since. I've put a potted bio of Stephen on the website, but I have to just mention a few highlights in case he's too modest to do so himself. His honours degree was supervised by the famous primatologist Colin Groves and Sir David Attenborough's son Robert, and his thesis is a very impressive piece of work reviewing the paleohabitats of several Miocene to early Pleistocene fossil sites of early hominids. It challenges one of the long-held myths against the so-called aquatic ape theory that it is contradicted by the fossil evidence. On a similar vein, his PhD thesis examines in great detail the molluscs present in the faunal assemblages of the early hominin sites. Again, it's a very impressive tome of some 573 pages and lends a lot of weight to waterside models of human evolution. Stephen has kindly allowed me to put both of these works on our website for anyone who wants to download and read them. Since getting involved, Stephen has published, to my reckoning, over a dozen papers, many with Marc Verhaegen, who is now undoubtedly the most prolific proponent of these ideas, culminating in one that I'm very jealous of, and I think every scientist surely aspires to, one published in the hallowed pages of the great journal Nature in 2014. It was a report of perhaps the earliest surviving record of the early human artwork, engravings on seashells at Trinil in Java, Indonesia, attributable to Homo erectus. Anyway, so don't want to go any further, but before asking Stephen to start, could I just remind everyone, please to stay on mute during the talk and to type any questions or comments that you want to make in the chat so that I can prioritize them at the end. Okay, so enough of me. I'm going to stop my share, and if Stephen, if you could now share your screen, and hopefully that will now be visible to everyone.
Okay, well, thanks very much for those kind words, August, and I have to say it's a great privilege to be here talking, and thanks everyone who's turned up to listen at various times all around the world. So as you can see, the title of my talk is Selling the Aquatic Ape Theory, and I think that comes about because after seeing the first two presentations by both August and Simon, and the discussions afterwards, there seems to be a lot of questions people are asking is how do we get this idea that that those of us who are interested in it and have taken time to look into it in detail, how do we get it to a wider audience? And so I'm going to give my personal view on that. It may not be one that other people agree with, but for what it's worth, it's how perhaps I see our best way perhaps of moving forward and getting these ideas to a broader audience. So just as an overview, I'll just give a brief overview of how I got into the aquatic ape theory and my background, and talk a little bit about what I believe are the main impediments to people accepting the aquatic ape theory or waterside models of human evolution, and then look at what I believe are some of the better selling points, kind of a blueprint maybe of how we might go about in a perfect world, selling this idea, and then looking at what some of the alternative models to the aquatic ape theory or waterside models are, briefly. So I'll try to keep it fairly brief. I'm not sure exactly how we'll go for time, but I want to leave some time for discussion and questions later on. So like many people who have been interested in the aquatic ape theory, my inspiration came from Elaine Morgan. I wasn't particularly interested in human evolution, although I've always been interested in evolution as a child and natural history. I remember I was watching with my mother, who was a biology teacher, a documentary on, and this is going back a long time, so I was only probably 11 or 12, and there was a documentary that mentioned water babies, and they mentioned the aquatic ape theory. And I remember making the remark that everyone knows that humans evolved sort of on land, so this is a silly idea. And my mum happened to have a copy of The Descent of Woman, which she said, well, why don't you have a look at this? And I remember reading through, and I think Elaine's great strength, obviously, as a writer came through almost immediately, and it sort of made such an impact that I thought, yeah, well, she's right. This savannah hypothesis, the great hunting man hypothesis, it doesn't make sense. She convinced me of that. And the alternative waterside model seemed to make perfect sense to me. So like I said, I was probably 11 or 12, but I wasn't particularly interested in human evolution. It's not something I pursued in any way. And for the next 10 years or so, it was an idea that I had in my head, and it was a seed that grew. But when later on in life, I was at university studying something completely different, but I remember going to the library and having some spare time looking for books to read, and I thought, oh, well, I'll see how the aquatic ape theory of human evolution is going. So I remember going to the section on human evolution and getting some 5 or 6 books out, looking through just to see where I sort of expected that the aquatic ape theory would have taken its place as one of the main theories of human evolution, but I didn't find a reference to it in any of the books that I looked at. And I thought, okay, so obviously it's been found to be wanting, and so there are better theories to explain, for example, why we're bipedal. So I started to look in specifically at those books on what the explanations were for the origins of bipedalism, for example. And I couldn't find any explanations. In fact, what I found was that Homo erectus, for example, didn't seem to be a particularly good biped. Like its fossil remains suggested that it was an imperfect biped, and this made me wonder, well, how did it become a biped? Why was it bipedal? How did it make a living? And again, those answers weren't satisfied to me in terms of those books that I was reading. So I became very, very curious, and in fact became more and more interested in this idea, and started to do my own research, started to go to the different libraries, put different books out, managed to find a copy of the aquatic ape theory, Fact or Fiction, and then started to develop what I thought were perhaps some original ideas on the aquatic ape theory, human evolution, looking more at Homo erectus, or what I came to later call the erectine grade sort of humans, and the idea that perhaps they were more aquatic than had been given credit for. And I wrote a brief synopsis of my ideas, and then found at work one day where we just started using the internet. I remember finding an email for Elaine Morgan, and thought, oh well, I'll write an email. It might have been the first email I ever sent. And I wasn't really expecting it I didn't know what to expect, but the next day I received a reply saying, I must have written something like, oh, hi, Elaine, I've read your books. It's really interesting. I'm really interested in the aquatic ideas. She wrote back and said, oh, glad to hear it. And we had a bit of a conversation. I ended up sending her a copy of the ideas that I'd written down. She wrote back, and I mailed it to her. I didn't know how to send attachments in those days, electronic attachments, but I sent a typed manuscript, which she then replied to a month or so later, again through the mail. And she said, look, I'm really delighted to read what you've written. It gives me great faith that, there are people following these ideas. But she said that the subject that you're looking at, the Homo erectus, isn't one that I've really taken a lot of. She's been concentrating, she said, on Australopithecines rather than Homo erectus. And she said, but you should contact this Dr. Marc Verhaegen, who's from a Dutch doctor, basically. She gave me his address. So I wrote to him. I'm pretty sure it was his postal address rather than an email address. And so I wrote to him and I sent him, I think, the same manuscript. And he wrote back and was very positive about what I had written. And in fact, that began quite a collaboration between me and Mark. And a few years later, I was lucky enough to during my PhD, visit both Elaine and Mark in Europe when I was studying molluscs in various institutions in Belgium and Germany and other places in Europe. So Mark, as I said, was really interested in what I'd written. And we started a long dialogue which culminated in a few papers, and over the, as August mentioned, over the past couple of decades, we've probably written at least half a dozen papers, perhaps more, and some of those, I'm very proud to have collaborated. And what I will mention that I began to collaborate with Mark before I went back to university to study biological anthropology. But everything that I learned at university, I'd basically, in terms of human evolution, everything I learned at university, I'd already essentially learnt through Mark. There was nothing that Mark had been advising me about through our collaborations, which wasn't collaborated by what I learned at university. So he's, this idea that Marc Verhaegen somehow is outside of the mainstream. I mean, everything he taught me, at least, was very, very much mainstream, and he was on top of the game. There's no doubt about that. So I feel very privileged that he not only was very generous in allowing me to collaborate with him, but has taught me so much about human evolution. So, as I said, I ended up going back to university. So I went from, as August mentioned, from Perth to Canberra to study under Colin Groves and Robert Attenborough, and it was very privileged to have worked under both of them. They were extremely good supervisors. And as August mentioned, my PhD was on the molluscs as ecological indicators in paleoanthropological contexts. And one of the things I discovered in my undergraduate course at university, I remember giving a seminar and talking about the fact that, even though it can't be used as evidence for a waterside model, the fact that all hominid fossil sites and archaeological sites are associated with water shouldn't be used against it either. It's not, and then somebody said, oh, but not all sites are waterside. And I said, oh, okay, can you tell me which ones aren't? And that person said, oh, well, I'll tell you next week. And of course, next week came along and they couldn't tell me. So I dedicated my PhD to trying to look at these sites in detail and see what sort of sites they were. And what I discovered was that where we find Homo erectus, for example, we find water, permanent water, in almost all cases. We find indications of permanent waters, biovalves, which are associated with permanent water, fish, crocodiles, hippopotamus, aquatic gastropods, and they're very wet habitat. So it reinforced to me what I suspected was that Homo erectus was very much a a water-dependent species or organism. During my studies, as I said, I was over in Europe and in Leiden in the Netherlands. I was lucky enough to collaborate with Josie Jordans and Frank Wesseling from the Leiden Museum. And we had a look at some of the shells from the Trinil assemblage, which were collected by Dubois. I photographed them all. I was lucky enough to be over there the week. It was a week of Ascension Day, and it was a public holiday in the Netherlands. So that day, Frank and Josie suggested that I photograph all of these are pseudodon shells. You can see the picture here. There was hundreds of these collected at the type locality of Homo erectus, which is Trinil. And these would only been studied once in the 1930s. And other than that, they're sitting in shelves in the museum there. And the idea, we had a look at these together, and we noticed some interesting fractures on them, and we wondered whether they were actually an assemblage that might have been manipulated by humans and perhaps used as a food source. And we thought the only way to find out is to do a study on them by photographing them all. So I photographed every pseudodon shell in the assemblage. And then they were put on a hard drive in Frank's office. When I got back to Canberra after my research trip, Frank gave me access, a code to get into that data set and download them onto my computer in Canberra, which I did. And as I flicked through them, just looking at them, and I was interested, as I say, in the fractures and some of the notches in them. But then I came across this one, and whether or not you can see it, but it's got like an engraving in it. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, well, that's quite a significant finding. And as it turns out, the team that ended up analysing that found that the engraving was as old as the shell itself, which is it's about 500,000 years. So it's one of the most significant findings in terms of, I guess, whether you call it artistic expression, but certainly for me, what it does is it puts these shells in the hands of Homo erectus, which is what I suspected, and I think in some ways it's quite nice to make that sort of discovery. But I'll go on to the Aquatic Ape Theory or waterside models, and I don't have a preference for the name that we call them, but I know that the Aquatic Ape Theory is what Elaine originally was calling it, and it fits perfectly well with what I know about human evolution. So I'm happy to call it the Aquatic Ape Theory, but also happy with waterside models, hypotheses, or literal models. But I think when we look at this quote, it is what we think we know already that often prevents us from learning. And I think that really sums up for me the difficulty that we have in selling the AAT to experts in human evolution, because the experts in human evolution are stuck in a particular paradigm. And there's a term, paradigm paralysis. I think this is where human evolution is at the moment. It's stuck in a place it can't get out of, unfortunately, and it's sad and it's frustrating. But there we are. This image, as far as I'm concerned, sums it up. It is what people who are experts in human evolution, this is what they believe. This is how humans evolved, because this is just an image which extends back to a time, when it's not based on any evolutionary theory. It's I think even experts themselves in evolution recognize it as a flawed model or narrative. It's certainly male-centric, which obviously Elaine was responding to in some ways. It's Eurocentric, but it's also anthropocentric. It sort of sees humans as the end product of a a line leading to it as the perfect sort of outcome. And you can see that the ones leading up to it are imperfect humans, but that's not at all how evolution works. Each member of that lineage that leads to humans, is a perfectly adapted organism to the environment that it's in. But now I'm not sure. So Monsieur Landau, who was who studied both evolution, human evolutionary theory, but also literature, discovered that, in her words, there appeared to be some underlying agreement about what happens in human evolution. In constructing their theories, most anthropologists seem to have in mind a similar narrative pattern. And there were four key elements that made up every narrative that she'd studied. And they were terrestriality, bipedalism, encephalization, and civilization. The one I'm most interested in here is terrestriality, which is a shift from the trees to the ground. So this is something that anthropologists or paleoanthropologists won't admit this. They'll say, of course, we don't write narratives according to this, but in fact they do. I mean, this is part of the paradigm, and this is why they can't get past Hardy or Morgan's ideas. They can't see that, because the paradigm that they operate in includes a shift from the trees to the ground. So Hardy and Morgan don't have that in their narrative, and therefore it doesn't fit in with the dominant paradigm. And to me, it's as simple as that. Unfortunately, it would take a paradigm shift, and paradigm shifts don't occur very easily, as we know. So essentially, this is what we're stuck with. This is the birthplace. And even though you'll hear paleoanthropologists say, oh, there's no such thing as the savannah theory, but I've read and I've read and I've read, and I can tell you this is where people believe humans became human, in the savannah, dry savannas. And you're talking about nature and the cover of nature. Chasing antelopes on the savannah is something that is widespread. People believe it. I don't believe it. I don't think there's any evidence to support this idea at all. I know that some people, even who are sympathetic to the aquatic theory, or even people who accept the aquatic theory, still perhaps have a soft spot for this idea. But honestly, savannah is very, very recent in terms of humans living in dry savannas. I would say in the last... there's no evidence that humans 2 million years ago were running over open savannas. That's all I can say. These are savannah hunters. This is not what humans are. And this brings us to the comparative biological data, which is the evolutionary proof that humans did not evolve by running over open savannas 2 million years ago to chase large ungulates. This is a savannah primate. So there are primates that have moved to the savannah. This is what they look like. They don't look like humans. They have fur, they're quadrupedal, they have snouts, they often have tails, they have big teeth. They're the antithesis of what humans are. So the comparative biological data is clear, as far as, in my opinion, that is. So in terms of selling the AAT, or the Aquatic Ape Theory, I think I've given this a lot of thought, in fact, and one of the things I think is, if I had my way, and this is the way I would do it, first thing we need to do is encourage people to think for themselves. We need to not, because I think this is the problem we have in science, is people believe what they're told. Now, I know that we do need to accept what scientists say, yes, and I think we do need to pay respect to scientists, but I do think also that we need to encourage people to think for themselves. Is the savannah theory a good idea? Is the idea that humans 2 million years ago were chasing antelopes to exhaustion, is that a good idea? Is that an idea that's believable? Try to picture yourself running 15 minutes and running an antelope to exhaustion in 15 minutes. Can you imagine that? And I think if we encourage people to think for themselves, think about what they might have been wearing, think about how they could have gone about making a living out there. I think that could go a long way to getting people to really see not only the flaws in the dominant paradigm, but also the strengths of the aquatic ape theory, which is very modest in terms of what we're asking people to believe. But we're not asking people to believe anything that can't be done by humans today. We need to remember that the aquatic ape theory is based on Darwin. It's evolution, it's natural selection. It's a lot more Darwinian than the alternatives. It's evolution through natural selection. So what we always have to think about is this an advantage? I know that in the mainstream, they're stuck because they're stuck on the savannah theory, so they end up having these convoluted ideas about, the most complex things you can think of, where they lose they can't see. That's what I'm trying to say. They can't see the benefits of evolution. We need to ask that very simple question: what was the advantage to this adaptation? And when you hear people talking about sexual selection and just things just coming about through chance, and that's what we often hear from the alternative models. It's either chance, because they can't explain it. There's no evolutionary advantage to it. Whereas in aquatic ape theory, Hardy and Morgan and Verhaegen talk about advantages. And Morgan in particular, you can see she was very, very, she was one of the closest to, talking about Darwin. She was very methodical about was it an advantage? And that's how she won her arguments constantly online. And I recall her doing it. And I guess that brings me to unfortunately, not wasting time on trying to convert experts, because unfortunately, I think the experts have made up their mind. They know how humans evolved. And so when somebody knows, it's very difficult for them to change their mind. I think if we can try to teach children about human evolution and students of paleoanthropology, but also look at other fields. Biology, they seem to be quite more open. Nutritionalists, psychology, there's probably a lot of other fields where possibly they're more open to these ideas. But again, we need to get them to think for themselves rather than be told how humans evolved. And I would say stick to our strengths, or to the strengths of the aquatic ape theory. So the explanatory power, the parsimony of the aquatic ape theory, despite what John Langdon, in fact, it's funny, what John Langdon, in his paper back in the 1990s, one of the only critiques of the aquatic ape theory that's been published in a major peer-reviewed journal, the Journal of Human Evolution. I mean, he would say that it has too much explanatory power. So we have to be wary because it tries to explain too much. That is its power. We should be celebrating that. That's a really good selling point. It explains so many things. It's a beautiful, elegant theory, and that's what science is all about. And we should be selling that. As far as I'm concerned, the underwater foraging is the key to human evolution. I'm not saying, I know that wading is very important, and I think there was definitely wading is something that we need to talk about and is a crucial part of the story. But, chimps and gorillas also wade, and that can't explain, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of the features of humans. Whereas going underwater is what humans do, and we do it well. We're not the only primate that goes underwater or even forages underwater, but we do it better than any other primate. And to me, this is the key: underwater. Not full-time, not fast swimming underwater, not deep diving, slow, shallow, relatively slow, shallow, and obviously part-time diving, as people do all around the world today. And to me, Homo erectus is the if we're looking for an aquatic ape, I think on Homo erectus, now there's a lot of focus on Australopithecines. I'm not going to go into how they fit into our evolutionary tree, but to me, Australopithecines were probably aquaboreal, so they were climbing, they were wading, they were foraging the water, no doubt, probably swimming, maybe even diving. But it's Homo erectus where we see in the fossil record the first signs of true aquaticism. So we see the large brain, we see the linear build, and we see the heavy bones and so forth. And I'll get to that a bit more in a minute. But the comparative data is what the aquatic ape theory is based on, and it's what Hardy and Morgan. I mean, it's how Hardy came up with the idea, was comparative data. He saw humans were different to primates. He was a marine biologist. He understood that they had similarities in some ways to the marine animals that he had dissected. He recognized that comparative data, and he came up with a hypothesis which has only been strengthened over the years. With all the data that we look at, there's nothing that has disproved his ideas, and in fact it's been strengthened over the years. Morgan was the same. She used comparative data. This is a strength of the aquatic ape theory. And unlike fossil data, and as important as fossil data is, fossil data does not, it's incomplete. Often we don't know what species, what genus. Sometimes we don't even know what family a fossil fragment might have belonged to. We might not know the sex. We don't know often the context of it, the age. So as important as it is, I'm not underplaying the importance of fossil evidence, but the comparative data, if we carry in our bodies the comparative data that we can use for biological systematic comparisons, other primates, other animals that live in the savannah, other animals that live in the water, other animals that run, other animals that sweat, other animals. We can use this comparative data. It is important. It is the best evidence we have, and it is it's a strength. You will notice too that opponents of the aquatic ape theory will quite happily use comparative data when it suits them. They'll say, oh, well, otters have fur and they live in the water, therefore humans kind of evolved in the water. Seals have fur. So, they're using the comparative data. They'll quite happily use it, but they don't use it methodically or systematically like the way we should. And when we do that, we can only come up with one alternative as far as I can see, and that's waterside and water-based models. And again, this brings me to another point. The opponents of the aquatic ape theory will quite happily pick on one trait and concentrate on that one trait. And if they do that, then they're going to be successful, because it's impossible to prove, based on one trait, a pattern of evolutionary a pattern of evolution. It's the combination of traits which are the strength of the aquatic ape theory. It's the nakedness combined with the subcutaneous fat, combined with the tool use, combined with the linear build, combined with the large brain and the external nose, combined with the fact that we sweat, combined with the voluntary breath control, flat feet. We can go on and on. All these things combined, it become the probability that humans evolved running around on the savannah 2 million years ago is almost it's impossible. Whereas the idea that humans evolved in a waterside habitat where they use the water to forage in, this combination of traits proves it beyond doubt. And if we did the probability on it, I don't know if there's any mathematicians, but the probability that all those traits came about and it didn't have anything to do with water, I don't think there would be any probability. I think the heavy bones, I call these the smoking gun, basically, of the aquatic ape theory. And apart from Mark and I don't think there's anybody else who seems to follow us on this, which can be a bit frustrating. But pachyosteosclerosis, or dense, heavy bones, which we find in Homo erectus, to a lesser extent in Neanderthals, but they're certainly there. These are only found in animals that dive in shallow, relatively shallow waters, dugongs, walrus, early whales, so animals that are making a transition often from terrestrial to foraging in the water. Fossil marine creatures, the sloths and bears in the fossil record that we suspect were foraging for shallow waters. They have dense, heavy bones. Same as Homo erectus. Now, this isn't something that's new to paleoanthropology. They're aware of this. John Hawkes raised the question just recently, why do humans have these heavy bones in their skulls? Why do they have heavy bones in their femurs? Well, what are these heavy bones for? And they've come up with lots of theories about why they do have these heavy bones. But to me, there's one answer, and that answer is they were foraging in the water. It's to do with making sure that they don't have to use extra energy to dive. This is slow diving. It's not fast diving. It's feeding on sessile foods such as seagrasses and mollusks. As far as I'm concerned, this, as I said, this is a smoking gun. Not only does it prove, and as far as I'm concerned, that these early hominins, Homo erectus, for example, not only does it prove that they were foraging in water, it also proves that they weren't running around in the savannah after antelopes, because you don't find heavy bones in animals that run long distances. It is a disadvantage, whereas it is an advantage to have heavy bones when you're foraging in shallow water. You don't need to, because you need to be the same density as the water that you're foraging in. Too dense, no good. You get stuck on the bottom, you can't breathe. Not dense enough, you're stuck on the top, and you need to use too much energy to get down to where the food is. You need to be the same density, and so the heavy bones allowed, combined with the lungs and the subcutaneous fat, allowed humans, early humans, in my opinion, to forage in water. And as I said, so underwater foraging, so it explains in Homo sapiens our streamlined posture, so the straight legs and the spine, which we only see in aquatic or animals. The hooded nose, voluntary breath control, which leads to one of the prerequisites for speech. Nakedness and subcutaneous fat, these can all be explained by underwater foraging. And in fossil Homo, we have the erectus, which of course Peter talks about it in his fantastic book. The heavy bones, as I've talked about, the long, low brain case without basic cranial flexion. So whereas Homo sapiens' head is more tilted down, or Homo erectus actually had a more posture of its cranially. So this would have been perfectly streamlined for moving in the water. A wide pelvis with long horizontal femoral necks. Again, the antithesis of what we'd expect for an animal that was running around on the open savannah, but exactly what we would expect in an animal that's foraging in relatively shallow waters. And as I said, the origin of speech. So there's another paper that, as you can see on the bottom there, Mario, Benny Shute and Mark and I, Seafood Diving, Song and Speech, which is in the ebook, which was published a few years ago. So it's not to say that diving or underwater foraging is the reason why humans speak, but it's a part of it. So the ancient singing abilities of primates that we see in gibbons, so that's something that we share with all primates. Sorry, all hominoids, apes. The voluntary breath control that we have at diving certainly seems to have a function in speech, but also the fine control of the lips, the jaw, the tongue, the larynx, and the swallowing musculature. And we've hypothesised that this may have come about because of a change of diet, so going from a primarily fruit and vegetable diet to one that also includes things like shellfish, including eating those underwater. And I know I've strong advocates of the aquatic ape theory have criticised us for this idea, saying that it's unnecessary to eat underwater, that there's no point in it. But to me, it's a no-brainer. I think if you're foraging underwater, if you can stay underwater for a few minutes at a time, if you find a mussel in the first few seconds that you go under, I'd say you eat that and then you move on rather than come back up to the surface. Humans can eat underwater, And I think that ability to eat underwater would take a lot of fine control of the tongue, the lips, also to keep the water out of the airways, and also the breath control. But it's the parts of the brain that these connect to, and these connect to the parts of the brain that also control the making of sounds. When we combine all this, and we see in particular Brodmann's area and the parts of the brain that are mostly controlled, the lips and the jaw and the tongue, the swallowing musculature. To me, this is a perfect, elegant theory. I remember when Marc first basically revealed this to me, I was struck by the elegance of it. And I say I'm surprised that it hasn't been more widely appreciated. But there you go. I think this is a strength of the aquatic ape theory, that the control of the way the brain controls the parts of the anatomy that are responsible for not only breathing and sound production, but also the fine control of swallowing. And when we think of the consonants that we make and the way our tongue and jaw and so forth are used in making sound and speech, I think this is one of Marc's greatest ideas, I think. And of course, that's combined with a large brain that was growing because of the DHA, which we all know that Michael Crawford and Stephen Cunnane have talked a lot about. So just briefly on the paleoecology. So this is just a graph that that sort of sums up in some ways the mollusks. I was looking at mollusks in different sites. I had a few non-hominin sites, I had a few non-erectine grade sites and a few erectine grade sites in my study. The erectine grade sites were very wet, as I said before. So you can look, for example, in Africa, where we see in the Turkana Basin, where we see early Homo agaster or erectus, and Olduvo Gorge, where we also see early Homo erectus. We see stingrays, abundant fish, freshwater mussels and oysters, gastropods, to reed beds, evidence in Olduvo Gorge, otters, turtles, frog, pelicans, cormorants, and this overlaps as well. I mean, these are very wet habitats, and it's the same for virtually all Homo erectus sites that you come across. You find these unionid bivalves. So this is one of the pseudodon bivalves, again from Trinil. You can see the little notch in it on the side near where we open mussels. And this is one of the things that drew us to these shells in terms of the damage to them, and perhaps we were wondering whether they had been used for food. But these unionid bivalves are found, as I said, in the Turkana Basin, Olduvo Gorge, but also in Irk El Amar, which is one of the earliest sites for archaeological sites in the Levant, and Ubadiah and Soprano, and Pakefield, which is in England, Mojokerto, which is an early site in Java, and as well as Trinil, Pabby Hills, which is a 2 million year old site in Pakistan, where there's archaeological tools associated with what we believe is, I guess, an early Homo, and Niawin as well in China. So all these sites, you see these unionid bivalves. These are freshwater bivalves. All these places would have been reached, I believe, via rivers. Certainly Turkana Basin, it had a stingray there. It must have had a connection to the Indian Ocean at some stage. And all these other sites, as far as I can tell, you would have reached, they're either estuarine or reached by rivers. So I think this is where we're finding evidence of Homo erectus, when they're moving up rivers from the coast. So that brings me to the alternative models. And again, I think that what we find in the mainstream can be summed up, I think, as far as I'm concerned, from what we see from Carl Sagan here, that so the suppression of uncomfortable ideas may be common in religion or politics, but it's not the path to knowledge. And there's no place for it in the endeavour of science. Accepted and conventional ideas are often wrong, and fundamental insights can arise from the most unexpected sources. So, I don't think Carl Sagan's writing about human evolution there, but I think you could look at Hardy's idea. It's an insight that arose from an unexpected source, but I think it's correct. And I think that the accepted and conventional ideas in human evolution are wrong. And I think that the suppression of uncomfortable ideas is not the path to knowledge. So I believe that, and so I'll just quickly have a look at some of the ways that people who are critical of the aquatic ape theory, for example, Clive Finlayson, and I know that he, so basically what he's written here is the dichotomy set up by supporters of the aquatic ape hypothesis between an aquatic or a savannah lifestyle, polarising the debate around which of these best explains the evidence, is false. Our earliest ancestors were not living on the open savannah. That does not mean that they were fully aquatic either. Now, what's been said here is that the opponents of the aquatic ape theory are polarising the debate. But in fact, when I read this, I see that the polarising of the debate is being done by the author here. He says that we're not living on the open savannah, but that does not mean that they were fully aquatic either. But that's not something that any aquatic ape theorist, as far as I'm aware, has ever argued. I've certainly never argued that we were fully aquatic. Mark, as far as I know, has never argued that, nor did Elaine, nor did Alistair Hardy. It's possible that some people do, but that's not what we're after. What we're on about. We're on about waterside models. So, if anything, I think that this is an example of a polarising debate, but it's been used against aquatic ape theories. And I think that if you look at Foley and Lahr, when in their criticism of the aquatic ape theory, they wrote, our knowledge of human evolution and prehistory shows that time spent in, now they refer, this is from a paper, and they refer to a diagram. And I think that what they're saying is that, there's time spent in waterside and littoral habitats. So they're saying that's fine. And they're very high over long periods. But this is very distant from anything to do with the AAH, which emphasises adaptations to deep water, or at least underwater conditions. But deep water, again, who has been arguing for deep water adaptations for human evolution in the aquatic field? Certainly not Hardy, certainly not Morgan. Verhaegen and I have specifically talked about shallow water foraging. So I don't know where they get this deep water from. Again, so the aquatic ape theorists get accused of sort of setting up these polarising debates. But in fact, it's not us. It's not deep water that we're talking about. But this is also interesting, or at least underwater conditions. So are they saying that humans could never have adapted to underwater foraging? Is this where we're at, that it's the underwater foraging that's the problem? Because as far as I know, humans do forage underwater all over the world. Australian Aboriginals, made a living from diving under the water. Maoris, Tasmanians, you've got shell middens all over the world where people have been diving to collect shellfish and seaweeds. It happens all over the world. And this is something modern humans can do. And we probably weren't as well adapted as our ancestors, according to the comparative and to the fossil record. And this is an interesting quote too. I have to admit I have a soft spot for the aquatic ape theory, but not in its full-blown form. I'm quite persuaded by the idea that we are coastal apes versus our close cousins, the chimps and gorillas who stayed in the forest, with a varied diet including seafood, and our expansion as a species out of Africa seems to follow the coastline. So that seems quite reasonable. So who wrote that? Well, that was written, I don't know if any of you are aware, that's Alice Roberts in 2008. So this is somebody who came down really hard on the aquatic ape theory when we, either after our conference or on the radio show that David Attenborough did. But I mean, in 2008 at least, Alice Roberts seemed to have quite a soft spot for the aquatic ape theory, as she says herself. So people can change. Henry G. described the aquatic ape theory as an arcane and eldritch item of fashionable nonsense in the shuddering slush pile of human evolutionary rubbish. Well, he says this is the aquatic ape theory. So where does Henry G. stand on, for example, bipedalism? Well, standing upright introduces a potential for all kinds of injurious stresses to the head, spine and limbs. To suppose that bipedality evolved for some reason or another is to belittle the immense changes in bodily form that the human frame underwent. Only sexual selection has the power to generate something as maladaptive, so seemingly pointless as a peacock's tail, or human bipedality. So in other words, Henry G doesn't have a clue how humans evolved bipedalism. He thinks it's sexual selection. So in other words, I mean, he doesn't know. He doesn't explain how this happened. He has a joke about, you know, women exposing their breasts and men exposing their penises by standing up and losing their fur and so forth. But basically what he's saying is he doesn't know why. And in fact, he's suggesting that there's no reason for it except that it's maladaptive, so it must have been sexual selection. Again, I think that once people start turning to sexual selection as a theory as to why something evolved, I think you've got to question that. It's the same with just it came about through chance, sheer chance, and sexual selection. I think these are things we need to be really cautious of. And I don't think if he doesn't have anything better to say, he shouldn't be criticising the aquatic ape theory, which does explain bipedalism a lot better than sexual selection, which is not natural. It's not natural selection. Okay, I'll just leave you. I know I'm running out of time, but so Daniel Liebman, in an interview I gave for Cosmos magazine a few years ago, he said, when he was asked to comment, why don't you regale your readers with other conspiracy theories like humans never went to the moon or that plate tectonics is a hoax? So this is where Daniel Liebman sits. So he's the author of well, I'll let him explain. Hopefully you can see this. So this is the Daniel Liebman. Oops.
Around 2 million years ago, there was a big environmental change in Africa, and the woodlands started disappearing and the savannas started growing. And at that point, new foods started appearing, and one of them, of course, was meat.
Okay, so basically, Daniel Liebman, 2 million years ago, savannas started to grow. The new food there was meat. And so his idea is that if we were hungry in those days, you know, we just ran after an antelope and got our dinner. And he talks about kudus, and supposedly it's the greater kudu because it lives in the savannah as opposed to the lesser kudu, which lives in forested environments. But here's a kudu running. It's been filmed from a car. So here's somebody in a car driving along the road, this magnificent kudu, which isn't running particularly fast at this stage, but it's running, and car speeds up a bit, and you can see that the kudu runs a bit faster, and then it actually starts accelerating. You can see there's a big, powerful animal. It's got huge horns, and this is the sort of thing that apparently Daniel Liebman believes that we could have just, when we were hungry, just ran after an animal like this until we exhausted it completely and it fell down dead. And then we could just walk up to it and, I don't know, eat it or carry it back to our pregnant wives. This is Daniel Liebman's idea that I cut this. This is filmed for about a minute and a half. You can see that this thing is running as fast as somebody driving in a car, and it's running magnificently. The thing is, Daniel Liebman has shown us. And so I just want to leave you with, this is Daniel Liebman running, and just try to imagine him running after that kudu. There he goes. Yep, barefoot, because of course, would have been barefoot 2 million years ago. Now, I don't know, perhaps you as the audience watch this and you think, oh yeah, it could easily outrun that kudu. We could see him running for 15 minutes and running that kudu until it was falls dead of exhaustion. Well, I can't see it. And so I think I agree with Elaine Morgan. You cannot stave off the aquatic ape theory to protect the vacuum. I don't think there is an alternative. I think the aquatic ape theory is the only game in town. Anyway, I think I've taken up all your time, August, so thanks for listening.
Well done, thank you, that's great. So if you could just stop your share.
Okay, stop.
Okay, so yeah, I've got so many points that I would like to make, but I don't want to say any more. I want to throw the door open to everyone. So I don't know, do you want to, Mark, would you like to chip in there? I think
yes.
You're probably the closest ally that Stephen's got, and so you maybe want to say a word in addition.
Well, thank you very much to you for this opportunity for the what talks. I have to apologize. I have just sent to my discussion group that this what talks began at 1 o'clock in Belgium, and I was totally wrong. And at 12 in London, but it's reversed. I'm very sorry. I have to apologize.
I'm sorry, but it's because Stephen's in Canberra. We had an earlier start this time.
Oh, I didn't know. Oh, then my wife was right. Usually she is right, but no, I thought she was wrong. Well, I fully agree with everything Stefan said. One thing I want to say, we don't know where our ancestor once completely aquatic, or more or less completely, not 100%, but we don't know what happened before Homo erectus. Was Homo erectus already returning to the land, and was there in the late Pliocene, perhaps 3 million years ago, an even more aquatic phase than what we see in Homo erectus? You're completely right. The Homo erectus was the heavy bones leave no other solution. They must have dived. There's no other solution. It's quite completely obvious. But we don't know what happened between the split of Pan, of the chimpanzees, and humans, which probably happened 5 million years ago. What between these 3 million years? We don't know exactly what happened. And I think that I lived at a time in the Red Sea. This possibly what Elaine has always said, Danakil is not impossible, it's just a possibility. But well, in my opinion, the Australopithecines are no human ancestors. You know my idea on this. The East African Australopiths belong to the genus Gorilla. I have no doubt about that. And most South African Australopithecines belong to the genus Pan, fossil relatives of chimpanzees. I don't have doubt about that. But it is still not generally accepted. It's another problem. But that leaves us, I think, I'm not sure of it at all, that early hominids, the last common ancestors of chimpanzees, gorillas, and humans, lived somewhere. We have the Trachylos footprints, the bipedal footprints of Crete, 6 million years ago, I believe. Dus in the plain Mediterranean Sea, they were feet almost like ours. And then some lived probably in the Mediterranean, others in the Red Sea, or perhaps in the Gulf. But when Homo, Pan, dus chimps, humans, and on the other side the gorilla split, it must have been in somewhere, I think, in the Red Sea. Because in my opinion, the gorilla, the Australopithecines, followed the evolving rift, and it was about 6 or 7 million years ago. And Homo Pan at first state was probably, we don't know, somewhere in the southern Red Sea, and then 5 million years ago, Homo and Pan split. And probably Homo followed, I think, perhaps they initially remained in the Red Sea, possibly Danakil, we don't know. But 2 million years ago, we see them in Java, in Flores, and later China, Pakistan. And we see Pan in South Africa. Dus I think that 5 million years ago, they split into Homo following the eastern Indian Ocean coast, and Pan following the western Indian Ocean coast to the south. But that is still is a gap. We don't know anything about it. What happened with our direct ancestors between 5 and 2 million years ago. And I don't know how much they might have been aquatic. Were they almost, I tend to think so, I don't know, but that it might have been almost fully aquatic. spending most of their time in the water, diving, even sleeping the water surface. Were very fat, probably. That density must have been almost the same as the seawater where they lived. Later, during the Pleistocene, different branches went inland along the fresh water, as one of the the slides of Stefan has shown. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mark. I mean, that's all.
I'm going to say that again, probably next week or so.
Yeah, next month you'll have your
next month,
to tell us all of your thoughts and ideas. I just want to bring maybe someone else in who hasn't had a chance to speak yet. So, I mean, Humphrey, Marc, Raina, I don't think we've met you before. Mark, do you want to say a word?
Yeah, a pleasure to join you. I'd be interested. I'd be interested if people have ideas about how much the chimpanzees and gorillas came back from a more aquatic model, which I think Marc Verhaegen was just talking about there, because this is I'm probably talking from a stage quite a bit behind some of you, but the ancient picture of graduating from gradually upstanding from a small monkey years ago seems to be the wrong way around. It seems that we were all far more aquatic and the chimpanzees and gorillas have gone back to far more terrestrial. Do we have some thoughts on that from Stephen, or is that just a different subject?
Thank you. Do you want to go with that, Steve?
Yeah, it's a different subject, but obviously related. And I guess Mark and I, back in 2002 or 2003, we wrote a paper called Aquaboreal Ancestors in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. And so essentially that idea is that some of the features that you see in some of the ape features we see, for example, the lack of a tail, the wide body, and the fact that they have they don't seem to have an underfur like the other primates, so they have sort of a scarcely covering of fur. That some of these things may be related to them having been more what we call aquaboreal, which is living in trees but also foraging in water. So, and this explains the bipedalism that we see. And as you say, rather than bipedalism, something that has emerged recently, bipedalism, or at least orthograde posture, so that is having a vertical posture, is something that goes way back in the hominoid or the ape family, and that human, so in fact, humans share with gorillas and chimps that ancient body form, which is more upright. So yeah, that's and I mean, my own personal opinion is that I think that when you look at the way a gorilla, for example, and chimps and orangutans for that matter too, the way they wade in swamps and marshes today, probably gives an indication of how the ancestors of the great apes perhaps once lived, but perhaps at a time when forests were more widespread and wetlands were probably more widespread as well, and that living in trees and wading in water can explain the larger size of hominoids generally, the lack of tail, the wider bodies compared to other primates like monkeys.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Do you want to say something, Leslie? Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thanks, Stephen. That was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed every moment of it. Just going back to one aspect of it, you were talking about the fact we need to disregard the experts and really focus on students and others. But the fact is, it's the experts who are teaching the students and others. So we do really have to get to the experts, and that's the big problem. It all makes such sense to us. But I'm interested to know, in your university at Canberra, for instance, what's taught there, because it seems that what's taught everywhere is still the savannah theory. So how do we actually make that change within universities?
Great question.
Thanks, Leslie. That is a great question. Now, I'm not sure that I said disregard the experts, but I think in trying to sell the aquatic ape theory, I think trying to sell it to the experts is a hard sell, and so perhaps we shouldn't be focusing our attention there. But I agree with you. I think that I would like to think that as people publish papers, that the experts would read them. I mean, Mark and I have published papers that, to me, and I know that Mark talks about the first paper he published, and he thought, oh well, now that I've published this, everyone will kind of come along with it. But that's not how it works, unfortunately. At the Australian National University, certainly the aquatic ape theory wasn't taught there, but I did find that there was an openness to the idea. It wasn't ridiculed the way it perhaps is, and I imagine in American campuses. And I was very fortunate that Robert Attenborough and Colin Groves were quite open to the idea. They weren't advocates. They wouldn't have gone out and tried to. They weren't converts, if you like. I think that they were both quite conservative when it came to the traditional models, but they were open to the idea, and they certainly didn't put any impediments. And I think that's what you want is lecturers to at least be open to the idea without having to necessarily push it. But it would be lovely if we did have some more courses that looked at it more positively. I'm sure that Augus's experience and others here could testify to that.
Definitely. I'm a little bit concerned about the time. We're supposed to only go for an hour. I'm going to keep going for a few more minutes, but I don't know if there's anybody who hasn't said something that wants to chip in.
Hello, everybody.
Go on then. And then Gareth.
Well, I'm sorry, I missed the talk again. This is the second week there's been some sort of mix-up with the time, because the last message came into the email before, said 12 o'clock London time. I see now that Michelle sent an email afterwards saying that it was 11, but I didn't catch that, so I'm sorry. Missed it by now, by the looks of it. So yeah, we've got to figure out the times, because I always get the wrong information, unfortunately. Anyway, I just wanted to say hello. I've never really said hello personally to you all before, and it's nice to follow these talks, and I'm really finding them interesting. So I will catch this one when Algis uploads it for you to watch it from the beginning again.
It will be uploaded. We did have an hour earlier this time, because Steve's in Canberra, and it's not really fair on Steve having to be up at midnight giving talks when we're all kind of at different times on the planet. I thought I did say that on the email, but I apologize if I made a mistake. Gareth, do you want to say a word?
Is that me? I'll just...
Yeah, Gareth Morgan.
Just very quickly, love the talk, love the phrase paradigm paralysis, but I think that there's only two small things stopping AAT being universally accepted. Two very small things. Stephen said people believe what they're told, and this is absolutely true, but where do people get their beliefs? Wikipedia. If you come across the aquatic ape theory, first thing, or anything new, what's the first thing we do? We go to Wikipedia. The article there is horrendous. It quotes John Hawkes talking about it as pseudoscience. If that's the first thing people are going to encounter, they won't go any further. The second thing is Google. If you Google the aquatic ape theory, you get Jim Moore, because he's got that title for his website. Yeah. And if so, those are the only two things. People who, I mean, it's all very well talking about winning the debate, but you can't have the debate if people won't engage, because, well, there's nothing to debate, because Wikipedia and Google says it's pseudoscience. Those are two very, very small targets to focus on. Now, I've written to John Hawkes. He refuses to read anything about AAT anymore. I've written to and had conversations with Jim Moore. He promised faithfully to look at the recent stuff and would enjoy tearing it to pieces. He came back with nothing, even after being prodded, even after being goaded into responding. He has not written another word for or against AAT ever since. Yet, although he seems to have been shot down and has got no response to the most recent work, nevertheless, he's the first thing people come across. If we could address, look, and there's rumors that there's one guy in the BBC TV who has been blocking this for donkey's years, but eventually he must be near retirement by now. So just the two things, the Wikipedia page and somehow Jim Moore. Because the rest of the world, if they don't go via that, 1.4 million people have watched Elaine's TED Talk. And however many have read the books or Attenborough's radio series and all the rest of it, people who are exposed to the theory happily accept it without any problem. The same as Stephen did, the same as we all did. We read The Descent of Woman and we were sold, basically. And as you mentioned, I mean, if you look on Wikipedia for the savannah hypothesis, that's dead in the water. That no longer exists. Nobody believes it anymore. But there's a vacuum there. And the reason there's a vacuum is because if people look for an alternative hypothesis, we get John Hawkes' blog, we get Jim Moore, and we get Wikipedia. And those are the places where I think our attention should be focused as regards the title of this Zoom meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. I've tried to update the Wikipedia page many times. I've had some success with Elaine's page. I did actually manage to get that to be changed to be a much more positive account of her aquatic ape work. But the trouble with all of the Wikipedia pages is that there's a whole team of editors who are all dedicated to reflecting the mainstream view, and it's very difficult to make an impact on that.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is difficult. I must admit, from my point of view, I think our best way forward is to try to get people who are kind of well known, who are kind of sympathetic to this idea, to come a little bit more on this side. That's why I was so pleased with Simon Bearder last month doing one, and I'm hoping that one day we might get Richard Wrangham to do one. And people like Daniel Dennett, who is openly supportive of Elaine, has been for years. If somebody of his kudos came a little bit more on our side, I think it might make more people change their minds, and then more academics might start teaching it. I noticed Michelle is here again. Michelle, can you hear us? And if you can, would you like just to say a few words? I'm not sure if he's listening. Okay, well, look, I'm going to stop recording now. I'm not saying that this is the end of the meeting for everyone who wants to stay, but I'm going to stop recording, and we can carry on the chat to anyone who wants to stay for as long as you want to stay here. But if you want to call it a day, that's completely up to you now.